Hey guys, I'm Redeemed Zoomer. So, if you thought my last video was kind of insane, then you haven't seen nothing yet. So, I've realized a long time ago that yes, there are lots of Christian denominations, but most of them are really just combinations of ideas of other denominations. And there's about four denominations that are really irreducible, four theological traditions within Christianity that really have unique and disjoint ideas, four theological systems, and everything else is just a combination of them. That's what I feel like. So there's the Reformed tradition, which is all focused on like the sovereignty of God and using reason to interpret scripture. Then there's Catholicism, which is similar to the Reformed tradition in many ways, but it has a much higher view of tradition and the ways in which we can sort of participate with God in terms of the authority of the church. And then there's the Baptist tradition, which rejects a lot of tradition and wants to only focus on the Bible. Then there's the Eastern Orthodox tradition, which is kind of like the Catholic tradition in its devotion to tradition, but it's a lot more mystical, and it's a lot less focused on reason, and a lot more focused on spiritual experience. So these are basically the four main traditions. So the easiest and most obvious one, and I think most Anglicans would agree, is that Anglicanism is really just a random mix of Reformed and Catholic. Because the Anglican tradition, it developed out of the Church of England, because the Church of England kept going back and forth in its history between Reformed and Catholic. You had King Henry VIII, who made the Church of England Protestant, and then Bloody Mary made it Catholic again. Then Queen Elizabeth made it Protestant but more moderate. Then the Puritans under Oliver Cromwell made it very Presbyterian and Puritan, wrote the Westminster Confession of Faith, but then there was the restoration of the monarchy, which made it more similar to Catholic. So it's just been ping-ponging back and forth throughout all of its history. The result has been a very big tent tradition where some Anglicans are more Reformed and some Anglicans are more Catholic. It's kind of like a melting pot. Now, what about Lutherans? Lutherans are sort of equal to Anglicans in their sort of high church, low church scale. Both Lutherans and Anglicans are sort of like those high church Protestants. And I've heard a lot of Lutherans admit this, they have a lot less influence from Catholicism and some Eastern Orthodox influences, to be honest. They're influenced a lot by the Eastern Fathers, about Eastern Christology and stuff. So I would say, I know that this is not like a chronological thing that happened. It's less obvious than with Anglicanism. But I would still say that Lutheranism is kind of like the average between Reformed and Eastern Orthodox in many ways. Like, their approach to scripture is more Reformed, but their approach to, like, reason is more Eastern Orthodox. So that's sort of what I would say. There's, like, a Lutheran mysticism that is similar to Orthodoxy in some ways, and it's also the reason most Lutherans who leave Protestantism end up becoming Eastern Orthodox, not Roman Catholic. Most Lutherans I know have said they'd rather be Eastern Orthodox than Roman Catholic, but as a Reformed guy, I'd rather be Catholic than Orthodox, because there's that common commitment to, like, reason and stuff. So if you combine Reformed and Baptist, you get Congregationalist. There are no Reformed Baptists, but I would say there are Reformed Congregationalists. I know that there are a lot of Baptists today who call themselves Reformed, but historically, Baptists who believed in predestination called themselves particular Baptists. The word Reformed Baptist is a very new term. Historically, the Reformed and Baptist traditions were very distinct, very separate, because they've had different views on all issues, not just infant baptism. But there is sort of a mix between the two, and that's Congregationalism. Congregationalists existed in England and then moved to America. The Puritans, the Pilgrims are Congregationalists, so the reason that you argue with your family over politics at Thanksgiving is because Congregationalists exist. So they basically have Reformed theology, but Baptist ecclesiology, which means view of the church. Like Baptists, they think each congregation should be independent, and that's why they're called Congregationalists. That's a Baptist view of the church, to have this very libertarian view of the church where every individual local church can do whatever it wants. That's a very Baptist view, the autonomy of the local church. But unlike Baptists, Congregationalists are Calvinist in most ways. They do baptize infants, and baptizing babies is a Calvinist belief. That's why Calvinist Baptists are not actually Calvinist. Calvin said Satan wants people to be Baptist. He said Satan wants people to be Credo-Baptist. Calvin was not a Baptist. All right? And I love Baptists, but I don't love when they call themselves Reformed, because they're not. But Congregationalists historically have indeed baptized babies. But because of the Baptist influences, they're less strict about Reformed theology. So I consider Congregationalists to be sort of like sloppy Calvinism. Some days I really simp for the Congregationalist tradition, because they did start Harvard and Yale, and I'm all about those big institutions. But at the same time, a lot of their ideologies led to this instinct to retreat from institutions, and the Presbyterian scholastic Scottish Covenanter Robert Bailey writes a lot about that. Here's another obvious combination. If you combine Catholicism and Orthodoxy, you get Eastern Catholicism. Byzantine Catholicism is just a mix of Catholic and Orthodox. So basically, Byzantine Catholics are in communion with the Pope, so they're Catholics, but their liturgy and, in many ways, their theology is Eastern Orthodox, and they'll venerate Eastern Orthodox saints like Gregory Palamas. Now, this might be controversial, but if you combine Baptist and Orthodox, you get Assyrian Church of the East. Now, I know that famous TikTok bishop Mar Mari Emanuel, you've probably seen him. I know he's technically not part of the Assyrian Church of the East. He's technically non-denominational. He started his own independent church after he got kicked out. But he is in that tradition. He was part of that. And he dresses like an Orthodox priest, but he sounds like a Baptist in his preaching. And that's not the only connection I make between the Assyrian Church of the East and Baptists. A lot of Baptists have a Nestorian Christology. A Nestorian Christology is when you separate the divine and human natures of Christ. Not all Baptists, but a lot of famous ones like John MacArthur will refuse to say Mary is the mother of God. They'll say she's not the mother of God, she's just the mother of Christ. And that's exactly what Nestorius got kicked out of the church for separating the divine and human natures of Christ, such that you can't say Mary's the mother of God, you can only say she's the mother of Jesus or the mother of Christ. And the churches that followed Nestorius are the Assyrian Church of the East. They are the historic Nestorian churches. So there's several parallels between the Assyrian Church of the East and Baptists. Another thing is the Assyrian Church, they do believe they're the one true church, but they're less strict about that belief, much less strict than the Eastern Orthodox. So I know that I don't know, maybe the 12 Assyrian Church of the East members that watch my channel, actually more like the 12 Assyrian Church of the East members that exist, are probably going to get very mad at me for this, but, don't take me too seriously. So if you combine Catholic and Baptist, you get Moravian. The Moravians were Protestant before it was cool. They were Protestants before Protestantism existed. So they were some of the earliest Protestants, so they retain some of the Catholic tradition, but they're also in some ways more radical than the later Protestants were. And some people have actually connected them with the Anabaptists. So this connection, this last one here, that's sort of weak. It's not as strong as some of my other ones. Okay, this should be a lot more obvious. If you combine Baptist and Anglican, you get Methodists. Now, as I've heard, this old Korean Presbyterian guy that I like, he asked me, do you know what a Methodist is? And I was like, yeah, they're from John Wesley. He's like, no, it is a Baptist who can read. And that's how I think of Methodists, basically. But Methodists are either that, or they're basically like low church revivalist Anglicans. So Methodists did come from Anglicans, but they sort of evolved into Baptists over time, if that makes sense. They evolved into like Baptists who baptize babies and the other thing. So that's why I think Methodists are sort of like Baptist Anglicans, if that makes sense, because Methodists are less strict about baptizing babies than Anglicans are. Now, there is a movement called the Pietist movement. Now, you might be wondering where modern evangelicalism, with its focus on personal experience and Bible studies, comes from. You might think it came from the Baptists, you might think it came from the Puritans, and there's some truth to that maybe. But a lot of it actually came from the Lutheran Pietist movement. The Pietists were Lutherans who rebelled against Lutheranism. They thought Lutheranism was too much about nerdy theology and the sacraments, and they wanted a real experience of God instead. So they became the Pietists, and the Evangelical Free Church, they're actually descended from the Pietists. They're Lutherans who rebelled against Lutheranism and became more Baptist. So the Evangelical Free Churches, I think essentially they are Baptists in most of their theological beliefs, but they have a Lutheran heritage. So that's why they're that. Okay, now this is another obvious one. The holiness movement, came from the Methodist movement, but they didn't think the Methodists were methoding hard enough. So I guess you can add Baptist to anything and make it more low church. So the holiness movement is like even more low church Methodists. And then a century later, the Pentecostals split from the holiness movement because they weren't methoding hard enough. Yeah, I said that in the last video. But yeah, so you can add Baptist to that to make it Pentecostal. Okay, so now if you add Lutheran to Eastern Orthodox, you get Oriental Orthodox. The reason I said Coptic instead of Oriental Orthodox is because, you know, there's also some other Oriental Orthodox groups. But the Lutherans have almost... they're going to hate me for this, but Lutherans tend towards a more Miaphysite Christology. They tend to unify the natures of Christ more than distinguish them, and that's the distinction between Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox. The Oriental Orthodox believe Christ has one nature, everyone else believes Christ has two natures. While the Lutherans are Chalcedonian, they do believe Christ has two natures. They often tend to speak as if Christ has one nature. They definitely lean more in a Miaphysite direction than the Reformed, and they accuse the Reformed of leaning more in a Nestorian direction. And the Lutheran Church was briefly in communion with the Oriental Orthodox Church. There was a bishop from the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church who visited Martin Luther, not a bishop, a deacon, who visited Martin Luther, and they realized their beliefs were like exactly the same. So briefly, the Lutherans were in communion with the Ethiopian Orthodox, who are also in communion with the Coptics and all of the other Oriental Orthodox. So briefly, Lutheranism was Oriental Orthodox, okay? If they're claiming to not be Miaphysites, then briefly being in communion with Miaphysites isn't helping their case. I just gotta say, I love Lutherans, okay? Anyway, so now if you combine Oriental Orthodox and Eastern Orthodox, I think you'll get Armenian Orthodox, because the Armenian Orthodox, fundamentally they are Oriental Orthodox, not Eastern Orthodox, but because of their proximity to like the Russian Orthodox Church and the Georgian Orthodox Church, culturally they're a lot more Eastern Orthodox than Oriental Orthodox, I think. So now here's a more obvious thing. It's kind of like the Byzantine Catholic thing. If you combine Catholic and Coptic, you get Alexandrian Catholic. If you combine Catholic and Armenian, you get Armenian Catholic. In both of these cases, fundamentally they're Catholic, they're in communion with the Pope, but they have the Coptic and Armenian liturgy and tradition respectively. Now, if you combine Orthodox and Anglican, you get Western Rite Orthodox. Most Western Rite Orthodox parishes are like former Anglican parishes that decided to be in communion with the Eastern Orthodox Church. And there's some like Anglo-Orthodox people who say, oh, Anglicanism is really Western Orthodoxy. I'm not sure if I agree with that, but there definitely is a strand of Anglicanism that thinks so. And this is my little circle I made for Western Rite Orthodox. I think this is the only time I've ever used that circle. So yeah, that exists. There is, I think the Eastern Rite Catholics are a lot more common than the Western Rite Orthodox, but the Western Rite Orthodox do exist. Now, if you combine Catholic and Anglican, you get Old Catholics. The Old Catholics are a denomination most people don't know about. Basically, they claim to be the true Catholics. They split off from the Catholic Church after Vatican I, the First Vatican Council in the 1800s, where they said the Pope is infallible, and the Old Catholics didn't believe in that. And the Old Catholics, they do claim to be the Catholic Church, but they're often in communion with Anglicans, so that's why I'm saying they're a mix of Catholic and Anglican. Now, what happens if you mix Coptic and Assyrian Church of the East? You get Syriac. There are a lot of Syriac Christians who are Oriental Orthodox, but they have a lot of the traditions of the Assyrian Church of the East. My face went blurry. My webcam sucks. Guys, if you get me to 1 million subscribers, I will get a better webcam. I promise. I might even do a rap about the Reconquista for you guys. That's how much I care. All right, so if you combine the Reformed and Lutheran churches, you get German Reformed. It's kind of the same thing as all these other things. German Reformed, they are Reformed, but because Lutheranism is German, they have some of those Lutheran cultural influences, and German Reformed Calvinists tend to have a much higher view of the sacraments than most other Calvinists. Next, if you combine Congregationalist and Baptist, you get Quaker. This is kind of like a weak formula, not much to that. I was just trying to get Quaker out of something. But basically, Quakers are like hyper extreme super Baptists because they basically reject all, role for any sort of pastor or anything. They're as low church as physically possible, but they're also very unlike Baptists, and they don't even really believe in getting truth from the Bible. They just believe in being directly illuminated. And these days, Quakers don't believe in anything at all, really. I went to a Quaker meeting once, and what they do is they just sit in silence for an hour. Anyway, so if you combine Baptist and Quaker, again, this is another weak formula of mine, but you get Restorationist. So the Restorationist movement is really where non-denominationalism comes from, I think. But at the same time, I didn't use that in the formula. But the Restorationists are where you get the Church of Christ and Disciples of Christ. That's the Disciples of Christ logo in that circle. They really wanted to rebuild Christianity from scratch, and that's why they call themselves the Church of Christ. Now, a lot of Catholics think that's what the Protestant Reformers were trying to do. No, they're trying to continue the Catholic Church and reform it, whereas the Restorationists really wanted to rebuild from scratch. And I guess if you combine Baptist and Restorationist, you get Seventh-day Adventists, who also sort of arose out of the Restorationist movement, but they really want to try and keep the practices of the early church that got lost thanks to Catholicism. And this is less of a historical thing, more of just a practical, everyday thing. But non-denominationals have often been described as a combination of Baptist and Pentecostal, so that's why I'm using that formula. Okay, as these slides go on, they're getting weirder, and I'm running out of ideas. But if you combine Restorationist and Catholic, you get Mormon. Why is this? Well, the Mormons are ecclesialists. Just like Catholics and Orthodox, they believe that they're the one true church. But unlike Catholics, they're not historic. They believe the one true church died out and had to be reborn. So if you combine Restorationist ideas and Catholic ideas, if you combine this idea of the one true church with the idea that Christianity died and needed to be reborn, you get Mormonism, and a few other things, but Mormonism is the most prominent. Mormonism is the most institutional of all the heretical anti-Nicene cults. And if a denomination is like heretical, I don't really give them a cross logo, I just sort of give them letters to show that they're heretical and I don't approve of them. Now, if you combine Restorationist to Pentecostal, you get New Apostolic Reformation, because the New Apostolic Reformation has a lot of Pentecostal ideas, but they think we actually need to have new apostles these days, so that's why they exist. And if you apply Restorationist ideas to the Seventh-day Adventist movement, which is already kind of Restorationist, you get Messianic Judaism. I'm ethnically Jewish myself. I've never had any interest in Messianic Judaism. And now here's the final thing. If you combine Coptic and Messianic Jewish, you get Ethiopian Orthodox. Why am I saying this? It's really because the Ethiopian Orthodox keep some of the old, ceremonial Jewish laws, like some of the dietary laws. All right, that's another huge, insane rant of mine, but, my specialty is thinking about different denominations. So when you do this for like 5 years like I have, you end up thinking of some really ridiculous things like I just did. But, I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you guys later.